Hello and welcome to The Little Simple Life, a podcast about living your most intentional, inspiring life. I'm Amy, 30-something mum of two living just outside London. These podcasts are love notes from me, sharing the things I know I would want and sometimes need to hear. In these episodes, I'm going to delve into what it means to walk a different path, from educating our children outside the school system to living in a small home by choice, surrounding ourselves with a life of intention instead of living a life of default. I welcome you to come on this journey with me, to open your heart and mind to a different way of living. I hope you find what you are looking for with the words of these podcasts, and I hope they speak to you in your own unique way. Hi guys, and welcome to today's episode. Today I want to talk about breastfeeding grief and trauma again, so here is a trigger warning for you if this is something that is too hard for you to listen to. If you haven't listened to my previous episode, in that I go into great detail about my experiences with breastfeeding grief and trauma. My experience with my first child, my daughter, was so difficult and ultimately led to me stopping long before I was ready to. This left me with an abundance of grief and trauma, which was absolutely devastating to me. Second time round, after really working through so much of that trauma, I was ready to try again with my son. There were times when I didn't know if I could even face the idea again, but I decided to give it a shot. I've currently been exclusively breastfeeding him for 9 months, and I couldn't be more grateful that that was my story after all that trauma. I'm a big supporter of breastfeeding, but even more than that, I'm a big fan of supporting women to feed their baby in whatever way they want to. I feel passionate about amplifying the voices of those of us who are suffering from the effects of breastfeeding grief and trauma. It hurts, it is relentless, and it doesn't go away. I have worked so hard on myself and dealt with so many of the feelings that I had left over from an experience that hurt me in so many ways. Just because I am successfully feeding my son now doesn't mean that those feelings of grief and trauma I felt with my daughter are magically healed. While yes, there are some very healing aspects of this experience, it doesn't take away everything that happened before. Infant feeding is a hotbed of mess when it comes to discussing things. It is a deeply personal journey, and I always feel like I can never really do it justice. Our decisions as parents are so personal, and there is really no way to compare. Not that we should. The things that we go through are ours and ours alone. However, there are also some collective thoughts that can be so helpful to deconstruct, so that others who feel aggrieved know that they aren't alone. I know that I am forever learning and understanding, so these observations are just my own. Often when I'm scrolling through Instagram, I find something around infant feeding that gets my back up. Most of the time I keep scrolling, but when I see the same misinformation or triggering content flying about, I usually just can't help myself. I of course never message the person who posted it, but I do sometimes share that triggering content to my stories with just a little thought about what's going on in my own brain about it. I come from a place where I had a dreadful breastfeeding experience with my daughter. I had to work through that trauma to be able to feed my son, and now have what I would consider a successful experience with him. Despite that success, I still find so much about the infant feeding narrative problematic on both sides. I'm pro breastfeeding and I'm pro formula feeding and everything in between. But mostly I am just pro women being supported in whatever choice they make. And I don't mean lip service supported, I mean truly supported. When women aren't supported in the way we need to be in order to achieve whatever feeding goals we have set for ourselves, then we are left to navigate the trauma of these experiences that were taken away from us. Recently, there are a couple of things been floating around that I guess are supposed to be funny, or I guess pro one way or the other of feeding. The first one I want to talk about, and the one that really got my back up as someone who was left with breastfeeding grief and trauma, is one that says the following. You were lucky you could breastfeed. Now, I wasn't lucky that I could breastfeed. By claiming that I was lucky, you invalidate all of the hard work I had to put in to be able to breastfeed. I breastfed because I was determined and committed to make it work, despite the adversity I faced. So I get the point of this. I get the beginning of it about not just saying someone was lucky because it invalidates all the hard work it takes to breastfeed. And I get that. I really do. But that last sentence, it's so triggering to anyone who has been through breastfeeding grief and trauma. And remember, over 70% of women who start breastfeeding give up before they are ready. And if my inbox is anything to go by, there are so many women living with the raw feelings that this situation created for them. New mums, second-time mums, mums with grown-up children, mums that are now grandparents, all living with the trauma and guilt that has never gone away from the way they fed their children. Guilt, grief and trauma that stays with them not just for those first years, but decades after their children were little. That pain is still there. Why are we doing women such a disservice when it comes to feeding? So that last sentence, I breastfed because I was determined and committed to making it work, despite the adversity I faced. No, 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 no. Gosh, this is just dire. It is absolutely dire, and what a gaslighting statement. It implies women who didn't breastfeed but wanted to just didn't succeed because they weren't determined enough or just weren't committed enough to making it work. No, just no. And you might be thinking, oh, it's just a silly meme, Amy, but it's not, because these are words that have been said to me in the past when I've opened up about the gut-wrenching pain I felt when it came to breastfeeding my daughter. I have been told by people that they were successful because they were determined to make it work. Oh. You see, that really hurts, because by implication that means all of us who weren't successful just weren't as determined or committed, or we just gave up when things got hard. The gaslighting, it is unreal. I don't sit here 3 years after the birth of my first baby, still hurt about it for nothing. If it wasn't important to me, if I wasn't determined or committed, then I probably wouldn't have felt the way I did for the last 3 years. The women in my inbox wouldn't still be grief-stricken about the way their feeding experience panned out. Women wouldn't be pushed to the brink of postnatal depression because of this. People whose breastfeeding journey didn't work out has nothing to do with their determination or commitment to making it work, and everything to do with a lack of support when they needed it most, or when things were out of their control, or things that happened out of their control. It's nothing to do with their commitment. People whose breastfeeding journeys did work is nothing to do with their commitment over our commitment. So let's stop gaslighting women over their feeding experiences, please, and start acknowledging that so much of this grief and trauma comes from a lack of support or consequences that were out of a person's control. Another post I've seen that I have found equally triggering is one that I suppose is supposed to be funny. And again, I get it. But I think for the 70% of us who sit here with regret over the way our infant feeding experience panned out, it feels like it's just not that funny. It's basically about how no matter whether our children are breastfed or formula fed, it doesn't really matter because kids ultimately end up eating McDonald's chips off the floor. I mean, it's not wrong, but let's delve a little deeper. The point of this post is that it doesn't matter how kids are fed because this is where they all end up. But it does matter. Maybe not to the kids themselves, or just like that other post where teachers can't tell which kids are breastfed, but it matters to us. It matters to us. Our feeding choices, whatever they are, matter. And this blatant disregard, this "oh well, fed is best" culture that continues to disregard the feeling of mothers, it is the reason that we sit here with this grief and trauma, probably for our entire lives. Because mothers don't tend to matter too much in this scenario. As long as a baby is fed, then that's all anyone cares about. Fed isn't best. Fed is the bare minimum. Supported is always best. So what about supporting mum? What about finding out our feeding goals so that people can work with us and support us into achieving them for our baby and for ourselves? It might not always work out, but it would be nice to be taken seriously and into consideration, especially when lack of support leaves so many mothers with grief, trauma and regret. See, it is possible. When I had my daughter, some of the issues we had were an undiagnosed tongue tie, jaundice, she lost more than 10% of her body weight, and she was starving. I could tell this. I could smell it on her breath. I even called back to the hospital and they said, well, that's strange. I don't know what that could be. And that was that. I was encouraged to give her formula, but I wasn't encouraged to continue breastfeeding so that I could eventually return to exclusively breastfeeding. And this sabotaged my entire experience. And I only know that now in hindsight because of this. With my son, everything was the same. He had an undiagnosed tongue tie. He had prolonged jaundice. He lost more than 10% of his body weight and was starving. And again, I could tell this. I could smell it on his breath. He also needed a formula top-up while I navigated some of the breastfeeding issues. Again, same issues as I had with my daughter. This time I had support from a lactation consultant that I paid for to guide me through what I wanted and not just what my baby needed. I of course would do anything for my babies, but the issue here is that you don't have to chuck everything you want aside. You might need to deviate a little, but you can, with the right support, come back on track in many circumstances. I was able to use formula top-ups for 24 hours before I was able to pump enough breast milk to enable us to do breast milk top-ups instead. And as his weight came up and the breastfeeding issues were resolved and he began to feed more effectively, I was able to remove the bottle entirely and get back to exclusively breastfeeding. 2 identical experiences, 2 very different outcomes. The first one did not honour my feeding choices and the second did. Both were experiences where we needed a little extra help from my baby, but the first one disregarded me in the scenario entirely and left me with what might be a lifetime of grief and trauma. And the second one factored me into the equation, enabling me to get back to what I wanted too. In all situations my baby was fed, but in the second one my goals were considered too, and that is so important. Posts like these go some way to show just how infant feeding is still such a vilified topic, where women who can't, don't want to, or aren't able to do certain things are gaslit with mindless comments about how they didn't try hard enough. I want to end on this. You did try hard enough. I know you did, and I know that because I am you and you are me. You didn't fail, you just weren't supported, or you encountered extenuating circumstances. It wasn't your fault. Don't let society tell you that you failed. You did everything within your power to succeed in an underfunded system that doesn't put your needs into the equation at all. You were failed. You didn't fail. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I know breastfeeding grief and trauma is a hard one to talk about. I am no professional, but I know one thing that has really helped me understand my feelings and experience a little more was the book Why Breastfeeding Grief and Trauma Matters by Professor Amy Brown. I would love if you could leave a rating, review, comment or a share on social media. Creating community is a passion of mine and I hope these podcasts can be shared to find the people who need them. Thank you again so much for your time today. I will catch you in my next one.